I'm Gail Dunham, Executive Director with the National Air Disaster Foundation. I've been in these shoes for almost 30 years now. Special thanks, though, to Robert Renzio for CERC and ISASI for bringing us together for this wonderful meeting. I've really enjoyed this time together. The National Air Disaster Foundation is also NATIF. We're especially proud of the legislation that we've passed that by air crash passengers going back to 1996. We're especially proud of the Air Safety Act of 2010, which was passed by the 3407 family members, but NATA has carried this legislation through years of rulemaking. Basically, the legislation from 2010 is the cornerstone and the reason why we have had no aviation fatal commercial disasters in 15 years. It's an unprecedented safety record. And there are many good people that worked with the family members and will continue to support that legislation. The National Air Disaster Foundation is a member of the ARC, Aviation Rulemaking Committee. We're also a member organization of ARAC, Aviation Rulemaking Advisory Committee. We've had those positions for 10 to 15 years now. So we often recommend people, recommend other experts to participate in those rulemaking. And we bring all parties together to support aviation safety. Today is a story of an air crash investigation with Boeing. With the 737, and it took 10 years from United 585, March 3rd of 91. It took 10 years for the NTSB and the industry to finally admit the true probable cause, which they knew for a long, long time. Just an overview of the 737, you've got United 585, March 3rd, 1991, Sunday morning. US Air 427, out of Pittsburgh, September of 94. East wind was June 9th. It was, there were no fatalities, but there was a serious rudder anomaly that became an important part of the investigation. Lion Air, October of 2018, Ethiopian Air, March 10th of 2019, and Alaska Airlines, January 5th of this year. There were no fatalities. There was something different, though, with Alaska Airlines. There was 177 passengers and crew, and it was reported that Boeing gave Alaska Airlines $160 million very quickly in initial compensation. And in the past, Boeing has litigated for years. They spent a fortune on lawyers. I think this was a step in the right direction to try and settle those differences so you can move forward to prevent any accident like that ever happening again. United 585, March 3rd of 91, and finally December 8th, 1992, almost 2 years later, the NTSB issued a final report. Their final report did not document the rudder control incidents, anomalies that were obviously known. They said the probable cause was an atmospheric phenomena, updrafts, downdrafts, to roll uncontrollably, a meteorological phenomena. Exhaustive legislation was never exhaustive. First thing about the difference on the design with the 737 versus the 727, many of you know this, but just to go through it, the 727 has 3 engines, 737 has 2. The 737 is the only Boeing plane that does not have a split rudder. It's a single panel. The 737 is the only Boeing plane with a single power control unit that runs the length of the aircraft. 737 has 1 power control unit, all the others have 2. With the 737, it's heavily reliant on the servo valve. I've held the servo valve, which finally got redesigned. It's about the size of a pop can, much heavier. But it was very powerful to see what this particular piece of equipment was, and I didn't understand why it took 10, 15 years to make the corrections. This is from a wonderful article, Seattle Times, and Byron Akihito was a terrific journalist with the Seattle Times. He did win a Pulitzer Prize for his research on the 737. It's a 20-page newspaper special edition. I wish I had more copies. Very thorough, wonderful investigative journalism, and appreciate the investigative journalism for any of the journalists. working with the data, obviously, to make this accurate. The United 585 was 9:43 in the morning. The NTSB is required to be en route to an accident immediately after notification. The GO team should be en route within 2 to 3 hours. Didn't happen. It was at 9:43 in the morning. The television showed the NTSB arriving after dark with John Lauber, and they had their first meeting at 10 o'clock. There was very few people around on Sunday morning when this crash occurred. It wasn't a normal operation. One of the things that was interesting, somehow a Boy Scout troop was called or arrived to help. And I received phone calls later on. How did the Boy Scouts get this badge to help with a plane crash disaster? Well, the only question you could say is, why weren't the experts there in a timely way? And John Lauber obviously arrived late that night. The reports are that John Lauber was in a 737 simulator just after the crash. He understood the rudder hard over that was possible, but he decided to call pilot error. The GO team did not seem to have a coherent force. Al Dickinson was reported to be the IIC, but for years he was always working on something else. John Lauber, had 2 terms at the NTSB and got a big job with Delta. And recently, January 23rd, 23, Lauber was talking about the Ethiopian plane crash, and he's still trying to blame the pilots. The flight was not in the news. The soldiers were all coming home from Operation Desert Storm. Perhaps when there was no news, that things didn't move as smoothly. There wasn't any public pressure. There's numerous reports of the 737 rudder anomalies prior to our crash, 585, and only a few made it in the final report. This is a letter. Keith Hagee was a pilot, a recent engineer for Boeing with ALPA, and he was a major person in the United 585 investigation. Clearly, he was sending letters to see if there were any anomaly reports. He received this reply from the Frontier pilots, and this is a 27-page document of rudder anomalies from 1969 to at least 1975. And Frontier was out of business about 1986. And none of this information made it into the final report. So I'm only wondering if there were more prior rudder anomaly reports that were suppressed. The malfunction occurred on several 737 aircraft. Flight attendants were injured. It was a defective part supplied to Boeing by one of its subcontractors. And the pilots' organization that provided this information was very helpful. The other thing is the 737 from the air crash had a rudder deflection of 10, it was reported a rudder deflection of 10 degrees on February 25th. 2 days later was a similar event on February 27th. Then on March 3rd was the fatal disaster. And some of the records, I put together the records of the investigation from a number of sources. The first report said there were 90 investigators, but only 18 were from the NTSB. And I think the meeting shows were small meetings, and United and Parker Hannafin and Boeing were investigating themselves. 3 weeks after the crash, they had the first group meeting. There's only 2 other group meetings that were recorded, February of 92, a year later, and May of 92. April 25th, 91, weeks after the crash, they said, we have a lack of understanding of the accident. April 92, 1 year later, the wreckage was examined for the first time. 92 and 93, they spent $150,000 on a computer to chase wind theories. And it couldn't interface, so that put a delay of 9 to 18 months because there were interfacing problems. The servo valve was broken open at United with Parker Hannafin. The internal contamination was swept away. They did further damage to the part before it could be examined. The NTSB allowed all this to happen. All Gall-in tests were done by Boeing. Joel Ryan was fired from the specialist systems and eventually removed from the 585 investigation. And the NTSB was just promoting wind theories. something interesting. There are people that want to do the right thing. December of 92, a reasonable time after the crash, Greg Phillips with the NTSB announced that Boeing had completed the design phase of the 737 servo valve, the retrofit, but no one moved forward with the retrofits, which could have prevented 427. But Greg Phillips was obviously trying to do the right thing. The other incident that was significant was the Mac Moore incident. This is a letter of reprimand from the NTSB to United. The incident was July 16th, 92. Mac Moore, who was a party to the air crash investigation for 585, had a rudder pedal stopped at 25 degrees, so he returned to the gate, and United decided that they would do their own internal inspections. He said, first, I was deeply concerned that we had not been informed, because this is written in August. They hadn't informed anyone. But United had not mentioned the case to the safety board because they had decided to evaluate before someone overreacted. The final result was that the NTSB had said that the information had to be returned over to the NTSB, and that the NTSB had experts. They needed to make a collective determination if this was relevant or not. So you had all these interested individuals making some of these decisions. On November 10th, Carl Vogt, who was chair of the NTSB, he sent a letter to Thomas Richards, who was the FAA administrator at that time. And this is in November, he referred to the July 16th Mac Moore incident. The other thing in this November 10th letter, he wrote quite a bit about the safety board understands the significance and the overhaul and the service that needs to be done to the PCU. Lots of things. It's a 3 or 4 page letter. It was very, very technical. But he also said, but pending the PCU overhaul and replacement program will be expensive and take a long time. But he said there's 3,000 737s, and replacing the servo valve will be very expensive. But none of this information was in the NTSB report in December. This was all suppressed. There's so much documentation about people that did know what was going on, and they were pretty much ignored. I like this one. Wouldn't you know it? The mechanics had figured it out. 5 months after United 585, Wayne Gallimore with the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers detailed quite a bit of detailed information about what the problems were. He said, I believe it's imperative that the United States be notified and a complete investigation done immediately. So the mechanics shared quite a bit of technical information. The records show they were ignored. Then we get into the We Have a Problem meeting. October 8th, 1992, Boeing had a We Have a Problem meeting. People were all assembled, and they said, well, there's 3 key points. This meeting was assembled so that then they would know what to present to the vice presidents. They were not decision makers. The vice presidents were going to decide which of the choices. So there were 3 things that they felt were important to try to get across to the VPs. 1, we have a problem. We don't need to ground the fleet, but we do need a retrofit program to fix it. Then they had 4 options. Here we go. Yeah, the valve doesn't meet the fail-safe design. We don't need to panic, but it does mean we need to fix it. Here you get the 4 choices that they had. Do nothing, minimum cost, high safety concern, retrofit at the next PCU removal, and it's higher cost. And then the current 4-year program would be a higher cost. A 2 to 3 year airworthiness directive program to deal with the rudder had undue customer penalties, and it was going to be too expensive. So they made the decision that they would do nothing. Well, this document worked against United, Boeing, and Parker Hannifin in litigation, because part of the litigation for the 427 rightly so. You have this meeting 2 years before 427, and you decided to do nothing. December 8th, 1992, this was the final report. This was the first final report that they had. And it was really to suppress the flaws. I was at that meeting. I have a videotape of the meeting. These people should be ashamed of themselves. Carl Vogt, John Hammerschmidt, Susan Coughlin, John Lauber, Christopher Hart. They knew what was going on. They knew about the rudder flaw, and they got up there and they lied. First of all, it was not a public hearing. United 585 is the only major aviation investigation that we know of that had no public hearing. It has public meeting because no one wanted to testify under oath. They spent a lot of time blaming the wind. It was pretty shameful. December 8th, they also released the first final report. At that time, they thought, this is it, this final report, nothing else. February 15th, 1994, they have another special report about wake vortex. They did this very, very expensive wake vortex test trying to prove that it was wind, and it wasn't. Getting into all the other documents here, the 1996, the unsolved, this was the unsolved accident summary with the 737. What they did, they documented all these things that they were going to do with the power control unit for the 600, the 700, and 800. But they didn't want to do anything with the retrofit for all the existing aircraft. Parker Hannafin had said they only wanted to retrofit or have the new part in newly built planes. Then they said it was too expensive. They finally had to build a second plant to finally meet the demand. And Parker Hannafin, of course, was the subcontractor. I think this is just another example where there's a huge problem with the subcontractor. And the airlines, the Boeing and everybody else, you've got to make sure what you're doing, what your subcontractors are doing. October then 1996, NTSB submitted a 26-page document to David Hinson. Documents kept coming and going. One of the things that happened, the Carl Vogt letter was November 10th. One of the things that happened that made a difference was that President Bill Clinton and Vice President Al Gore were elected. They were elected on November 3rd, and then his letter was November 10th. I think maybe he just wanted to cover himself. And this was a very positive move. After they were elected, so many things were happening. They brought in Jim Hall. Jim Hall was brought in 93, and he became chair of the NTSB about 94. There's a lot of interesting things that Jim Hall accomplished. 10 years later, we're getting this final report. There was also this rudder conference, which was 1997. I understand that the redesign was to make the slides longer, to make some modifications so that it didn't jam, so it wasn't a reverse, it wouldn't go in reverse. The NTSB at that time then was very aggressive in going after as much information as possible and to try and get it out. Jim Hall created a special independent investigative group. And I have to thank Paul Nurr in California and the people that worked on that. And that was like March of 96 through 97. And they came up with the retrofit recommendations. But this was the first, and what we've heard the only time, where the NTSB brought in an independent expert panel. And it worked very well. I think they all did a good job. But big day was March 23rd, 1999. That was the final report for US Air 427. And they included United 585. And Jim Hall has said, the final report is very unlikely that the loss of control of 585 was the result of a mountain rotor. In fact, Jim Hall reported, a wind rotor would have had to have been 36 times greater force than the strongest rotor ever recorded in Colorado Springs. And there's additional technical information that the wind rotor did not bring down the 737. In the meantime, you've got 7-8 years, and you still do not have a servo valve that you really should have. The revised final report for United came on June 5th, 2001, and the report, if you ever look at the report, there's all these vertical lines in the in the paragraphs, that's all additional information that was provided. A lot of that additional information was very familiar to me because I'd been filing FOIA Freedom of Information requests, and I was collecting documents from whoever would talk to me. So I have quite a file at home. So the final report does include all of this information. It should never, ever take 10 years for something like this. Couple things, just one thing about the litigation that I think is important. Here's the litigation. There was a civil trial in Pittsburgh over who was liable for US Air 427. It was in 2002. And the jury was able to hear the voice recorder from 427 and watch the 23-second video. And the jury, US Air, has sued Parker Hannifin, who is based in Ohio, and the maker of the hydraulic valve. After a month-long trial, US Airways won, and the jury ruled that Parker Hannifin was 75% liable for the crash, and Boeing was 25% liable. And Parker Hannifin was not successful in blaming the pilot, but they were still trying. The other litigation was the litigation for US Air 427 from the family members, and they requested punitive damages. And they had a number of things in their lawsuit. There has to be a penalty when someone is not cooperating and people's lives and the whole aviation industry is involved. You have just got to go for the truth. It's going to come out in the end. So they had asked for punitive damages. The facts were overwhelming. Boeing 737 began in 1964. First aircraft flew April 9th of 67. Boeing knew about all of the problems with the PCU. In the litigation, the legal filings had 180 incidents of the power of control failures or problems with it from 427. 150 predated 427 in 1994. They also included Greg Phillips' recommendation, and the court filing disagreed. The court also disagreed. Boeing said this is all considered proprietary. It's provided on a confidential basis only to the government. The jury said no, or the judge said no. So Boeing and Parker Hannifin already knew in the 1960s that they had an intermittent condition with the PCU. Boeing's reputation was also contrary to their own patent documents, which were included in this legal filing. The We Have a Problem meeting worked against them because it was pointed out that they knew that 2 years before the crash, they decided it was too expensive. They could have done so much more, so much earlier. Boeing chose an economic benefit, do nothing. A couple other things, additional information. I think additional information about the 737. Tom McSweeney was an aeronautical engineer, and he was hired by the FAA in 1974 as a certification expert engineer in Los Angeles. He moved to the FAA headquarters in '79, and before he moved to the top spot, he was Director of Aircraft Certification Service. He retired from the FAA 2007 with 28 years of service. McSweeney left the FAA to join Boeing. He got a big job, International Safety and Regulatory Service Affairs. And he said Boeing had offered him more money just to remain in the DC area. At McSweeney's position, Tom McSweeney's position at the FAA, he certified that the Boeing 737 could continue to make modifications and the 737 would not be subject to a total recertification. That's one of the things we're dealing with today. That aircraft has changed so much from a 737-200 to an 800 MAX, and there has been no total recertification. It's just all been steps along the way. The other thing that happened, March 23rd, 1999, at the 427 public hearing, Tom McSweeney was there working the press. He was trying to convince them that the two slides in the servo valve were equal to the redundancy of two power control units, literally working the press that day. But that was an interesting day, too. One of the things that happened with 427, They had the public hearing, full court press, family members were there were hundreds of people there. And then in the afternoon, it was announced that President Clinton had started bombing Kosovo. That was it. So the press left, and we really didn't get the news that we thought we were going to get. So it was all kind of toned down. But obviously the truth was current. I think I have some personal recommendations for Boeing, and probably what's most important, because I've just had 1 minute out of time. On February 6, 2024, our new FAA Administrator, Michael Whitaker, gave a very positive comments to a House hearing on transportation. I was pleasantly surprised when Whitaker talked about the increased oversight of Boeing. Boeing still travels, millions of people are getting where they're going, but we have so much more oversight now. They're in the news every day. I think that I have some positive suggestions what they could do about their corporate culture, but they are in the news every day, and they've got to try and get this together. So I can tell you that myself, our president, Matt Zimkwitz, all of our members really support the increased oversight of Boeing, and I hope it's all positive for them. Thank you very much. Couple of recommendations for Boeing. I do want them to succeed. It's an enormous part of our economy, but we have to succeed globally. They've got to get it together. You can't let this stuff happen. You can't have people that just go in there for corporate greed. Number one, reinstate the Boeing annual shareholder meeting in person, not to have some lecture sounds like it's coming across the radio. They used to have the annual meeting in Chicago, tremendous presentation about all of the Boeing products. People could go and ask questions. We're shareholders. I could go, and he said, "Hi, Gail." But everyone there could still ask questions. You could still remote it. But that shareholder meeting should be a public meeting for shareholders, not just by invitation for the big shareholders. The shareholders now only get like a radio lecture. The shareholders' initiatives that were filed were all excellent, but they're totally dismissive of anything they have to say. They need to think about who they should be serving, and it's obviously the passengers too, and the military, and the global economy. The corporate culture, I've said this, Boeing does not like people. Someone needs to think about the passengers and the people and their product is supposed to serve in so many ways. Boeing should investigate and suppress and stop the conspiracy theories like TWA 800. It was never shot down. They just didn't want to take accept the corporate responsibility. And United 585 was a technical and mechanical failure, not the wind, but to fight it for 10 years and it still didn't work. I think they need to suppress and do what they can to eliminate some of these conspiracy theories. And I hope that the 737 MAX talk about more of the improvements. There's obviously more in the news, and I would do anything to help them have a better day. Thank you.